of the clear blue sky. And the tears that I cried for that woman gonna flood you, big river, and I'm gonna sit right here until I die. I met her accidentally in St. Paul, Minnesota, and it tore me up every time I heard her drawl, southern drawl. Then I heard my dream, went back downstream, cavorting in Davenport, and I followed you, big river, when you called.
Well, hello, and welcome back to the American Writers 100 Pages at a Time podcast. In this episode, I'll be finishing up my thoughts about The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, which will get us pretty close to finishing up our series on Mark Twain's Mississippi writings. The first volume of Mark Twain's writings included, published by the Library of America. So, I think if you've listened to the last two episodes where I covered the first 2/3 of this novel, you know more or less what I think about it. And I don't think that's a particularly unique or or distinctive interpretation. I think these ideas about this novel have been out there for a while. But anyways, one thing I talked a lot about in the last couple episodes was the interaction between Huckleberry Finn in the adult world, right? And the kind of the cloud that overhangs this is not the N-word; it's the infantilization of Jim, right? Because if all adults are bad, Jim is not bad, then is Jim not being treated as an adult? And then the question is that racist, or is that a reflection of how America saw African Americans in slavery with the paternalistic logic? Is it, of course, there's, the argument that it's a form of the rebellion or the resistance of enslaved men and women to put on a facade of childishness in order to craft out a space of freedom for themselves. Right, and I think that's happening here too. Huck Finn is able to craft out a space of freedom for himself too by playing the adults against their own values. Right, so I do think there's a radical reading of Jim in that space. But there at the same time, it seems like being moral doesn't seem to require it requires never growing up. Or growing up just enough to reach moral maturity. That's what I was saying last time. So Huck Finn spends all of this novel in rebellion against civilization, right? He flees Widow Douglas and Pap, and he wants to go on to Indian country at the end. So anyways, what happens in the last part of the novel, right? You probably know. They eventually make their way to the Phelps farm, where the Duke and the King sell Jim to the Phelps. And so Jim is re-enslaved, essentially. And so, of course, they're con artists. They didn't have the right to do that, but then they leave. And later on, they're tarred and feathered. They try to do the royal nonsuch again. And we get this backstory later on. But they run into the Phelps, and the Phelps are actually relatives of Tom Sawyer, and they think Huck Finn is Tom Sawyer. And later on, Tom Sawyer comes, and he realizes that this is going to be fun to play essentially a game about this. So he says he's Sid, Tom Sawyer's older. He's a brother, anyways. Yeah, I think it's a younger brother. We met him in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and then now Tom Sawyer by this point knows that Jim has been actually legally freed by the Widow Douglas because she died, but he doesn't tell Jim or Huckleberry Finn this. Instead, he just wants to play, and so Jim by the end of the novel becomes a plaything of not Huck Finn, let's be clear, but of Tom Sawyer, and that certainly casts some shadow over how we interpret and think about his particular character. But what is he going to play at? He's going to play at what we'd expect Tom Sawyer to play at, which is literary archetypes, popular fiction archetypes. And he's done this throughout his stories. In the Adventures of Tom Sawyer, you saw him play pirate or bandit, and that's kind of picked up early in the story where Huck Finn is part of the bandit gang with Tom Sawyer. That's how they spend their time together. And, of course, Huckleberry Finn goes on and has real adventures, not the fake ones, not the imaginary ones, but Tom Sawyer wants to just essentially play with Jim and Huck and act out an escape. And so they play these, he, I should say, not Huckleberry Finn is always earnest throughout this. And the game essentially is like, oh, we got to put rats in the place he's living because prisons have rats, or we got to have him write his memoirs on a bloody shirt, on a t-shirt with blood or something, because that's what happens in the novels, or the escape has to be this way because that's what it is in the novels. Tom Sawyer is fully memized. I mean, everything's a meme for him. He's totally ensconced by popular culture. He's very much one of us. He's of our generation, I think, in that sense, where the reality is always being mediated by popular culture tropes. Now, I don't know if that was the general perspective of people in the 1840s, 1850s, but certainly Tom Sawyer is looking ahead to an America that would much more be simply a product of popular culture. And I think that's one of the more kind of devastating and troublesome aspects about that character, because he really doesn't do anything, like, at least especially not in this novel. Maybe in Tom Sawyer itself, you see a moral progress to that character. But in this novel, he is just fulfilling the expectations given to him by popular novels that he's reading. And he really likes that escape genre. And let's be frank, he probably hasn't read that many novels. He's probably read just maybe one or two. And that's his understanding of it. Or maybe he's just heard stories from people who have read them. Of course, there's no TV at that time for him to kind of get that. But if Tom Sawyer was living today, he would be someone watching TV all the time and playing like those archetypes, like, like someone who watches The Wire too much and then is out playing and say, well, one of you has to be Omar, right? And Omar has to like walk in with a shotgun at this point. And the other one's like, well, why do I have to do this? And he's like, well, that's just the way it is. That's what Tom Sawyer always says. Is like, that's the way it is. That's the way it always is in the stories. And that's the way it must be for us. So he can't escape that. He's totally in this kind of cocoon of fantasy. And Huck Finn is trying to do something earnest and relevant to him. And that's why we have to go back to his moral decision. His decision to free Jim. It happens in chapter 31 of the novel. And it's really profound. Let me find the exact wording of it. So we begin with Huck thinking about his past with Jim. He says, but somehow I couldn't seem to strike no places to harden me against him, but only the other kind. I'd see him standing my watch on top of his, instead of calling me so I could go on a sleeping, and see him how glad he was when I come back out of the fog, and when I come to him again in the swamp, up there where the feud was, and such times, and he would always call me honey and pet me and do everything he could to think of me, and how good he always was. And at last I struck the time I saved him by telling the men we had smallpox aboard. And he was so grateful and said I was I was the best friend old Jim had ever had in the world, and the only one he's got now. And then I looked around to see the paper. It was a close place, and I took it up and held it in my hand, and I was trembling because I got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I noticed. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then I says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell, and tore it up. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they were said, and I let them stay said, and I never thought no more about reforming. I shoved the whole thing out of my head, and I said that I would take up wickedness again, which was in my line being brought up to it, and the other weren't. And for a starter, I would go to work and steal Jim out of slavery again. And if I could think up anything worse, I would do that too, because so long as I was in, and in for good, I might as well go the whole hog. End quote. Now, this passage, it's 2 paragraphs, and you'll notice what word is not included in this passage. In this moment, I mean, I don't know. There's probably good arguments to be made that Mark Twain overuses that word, the N-word, in this novel. I don't know. But the fact that it's not used at the moral center of the novel, I think, is significant. I think Mark Twain could have included that word here because he used it all throughout the novel and other places, but he doesn't. So when Huck is at his space of moral realization that his soul is less important than that of Jim's, or equals to Jim's, and therefore he should sacrifice himself, even if it means going to hell. Sacrifice himself in every way to save him. He doesn't think of him as the N-word, right? And I think that's significant. Now, it's not that the word isn't used again later in the novel, but it's often used by Tom Sawyer more than it is by Huck Finn, but it would take a analysis. But I'm guessing you're going to see that word used less in the later part of the story. So now, as I said, you get this playing by Tom Sawyer, who's playing a thief trying to steal a slave away from its master. The whole time he knows Jim's already freed. So Jim is locked up with rats and being forced to do things for Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn that he doesn't have to do because he is a free man. He has his life, his $800, which is what he's worth. But he's trapped by the circumstances, by these kids, by white kids, right? So again, we have a hierarchy kind of being imposed that, yeah, kids and blacks are under white men throughout the novel, but when push comes to shove, the white kids are above a black man, right? Obviously, that's the case in slavery. So, yeah, I think the story ending with his decision to move to Indian country, but between that moral revelation that I just read to you and the conclusion, which is really just the last line, and it's kind of a shame that Huck Finn doesn't disappear from the world at that point. It contains a lot of moral wisdom here in this part of the novel. And I know it's often maligned, and people criticize this part of the novel because Jim becomes a plaything of the boys. But again, it's only one of the boys. It's like, we got to understand that Tom Sawyer is not the moral exemplar of this novel. It's Huck Finn is. And as much as we like Tom Sawyer in his book, and as much as we saw him grow and mature, he is always going to be a product of his culture. Right? He is not feral. Huck Finn was feral, is feral. He was mildly civilized by Watson. So anyways, Huck writes this letter to Watson. That's what he rips up in the passage I meant. He's going to tell Miss Watson about Jim's location. He based this decision on what he'd been told, religious law. The plain hand of providence slapping me in the face and letting me know my wickedness was being watched all the time from up there in heaven whilst I was stealing a poor old woman's Negro. And then he thinks, I couldn't seem to strike no place to harden me against him. Right? I already read this. But that's the passage. That's the moral awakening, the moral gravity of his choice. It places Huckleberry Finn in total rebellion against civilization. He says, I never thought no more about reforming. It's not just he's going to be a thief. He is rejecting everything that society has taught him. Right? And he saw society through the Duke and the King, or through the Shepherdsons and the Grangerfords, or through the criminals he sees on the street, or through the lynch mobs. He's seen society, and it's not pretty. He saw what reform leads to, and he rejects that. It's not new. I mean, Huck is always kind of feral, but he becomes a revolutionary. He takes his resistance and he outwardly pushes it to liberate society. Now, of course, it's just one person at this point, but it's that idea that the hierarchy itself is unacceptable and must be destroyed. And the way I fight against this is by freeing who I can. Right? It's the same logic of John Brown, actually. That's what makes this novel so kind of revolutionary, I think. Now, one reason it's different is before he rebelled against moral reform for personal liberty. Right? Go live with Pap. Go, escape the Widow Douglas or whatever. But at this point, he's willing to risk his eternal soul, essentially his life, in the aid of a friend. His thoughts dwell on the solidarity that's been built up between the two, right? Which is, of course, the foundation of any revolutionary action is solidarity. Now, Jim has been living as a slave in slavery on the Phelps farm, but he's already been freed according to Miss Watson's will. So again, we see that society is failing Jim and Huck in a way. Although Huck's got his money, he's kind of saved by Judge Thatcher, right? His money is kind of preserved. He still has every dime of it, but Tom Sawyer clings on to Huck's idea to free Jim, and he makes it a game. And this is a point of general tension between the two. And Huck actually fights back against this, saying, we don't have to do it this way. It's just we just open the door, right? And we can get him out. We don't have to make it this elaborate. We don't have to dig a trench through, dig it with a spoon or whatever. But Tom Sawyer wants to reenact the great escapes he reads about in these books. Huck is searching for the most effective and safe way to free Jim. Of course, thinking he's still enslaved, thinking his soul's at great risk. He's always nervous about that. And thinking about the other risks involved in his action. Now, Tom Sawyer lacks solidarity with Jim, believes the stakes are low, knows the stakes are low, and Tom Sawyer can't take it seriously. So he constructs all these elaborate mechanisms instead of simply liberating Jim. It's like the liberal perspective, to be honest. It's we'll pass some kind of Baroque law, or we'll have an election in 2 years that's going to bring in the people who are going to pass the laws that are going to reform society. It's like that scene in the Boondocks, right, where Jasmine is basically enslaved by Mr. Onceler, and Huey's just free the girl, right? We don't have to sit around and sing songs and chant or something. It's just the oppression is right in front of us, and we just got to end it. So Tom Sawyer is like a liberal here, play acting at revolution, and not actually trying to achieve it. Now, Huck's maybe not entirely pure, right? He treated Jim like a plaything earlier in the novel, but he's not now at this point. So I actually like this end. I don't understand the people who maybe don't like it that much, because maybe they put too much value on the character of Tom Sawyer, maybe. All right, that's when they're separating the fall, right, where he plays with him. Huck pretends it was just a dream, but Huck can't do that anymore. Huck is earnest at this point. Shared sacrifice and solidarity created the moral necessity and seriousness required of this revolutionary path that Huck pursues at the end of the story. And this is something Tom can't see or even understand. And that's again I think the problem of liberalism is it can't actually see the moral. They're not at the moral certainty of self-sacrifice for something greater, for each other. They're not willing to fall on their sword for each other. They care more about perpetuating the fight against the baddie, right? Which ends up becoming mythologized. It becomes a story, right? Oh, don't do it that way. It's supposed to be done this way, right? That's Tom Sawyer in the novels, right? Talking about the novels. It's supposed to be done this way. It's like the liberal politicians say, well, you can't just forgive the debt. You gotta, that's not how it's done in the stories. In the stories, we gotta, forgive a little bit of the debt and then have it sued in a court case about it. And then we gotta, maybe have some kind of income-based repayment, means-tested thing, because that's how it's done. It's that's why Tom can never be a revolutionary, and Huck is, because Huck has the shared solidarity and the moral necessity. So obviously there's a warning here against a too carnivalesque, a too playful approach to revolution and resistance. Now, Emma Goldman says, I don't want a revolution without dancing. But revolution's deadly serious. And that's why this novel ultimately is deadly serious. And it can't require play. That doesn't, we must do it. What must be done must be done. It's like Lenin, right? I mean, this is, if Lenin read this book, he would understand, I think, what is to be done. And what is to be done is Jim needs to be freed. This is what Tom says. He says, you got to invent all the difficulties. Well, we can't help it. We got to do the best we can with the materials we got. Anyhow, there's one thing. There's more honor in getting them out through a lot of difficulties and dangers where there weren't one of them furnished to you by the people who it was their duty to furnish them, and you had to contrive them all out of your head. So, yeah, just do what needs to be done. That's the point. So at the end of the Adventures of Huckleberry, the end of the Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Huck chooses to be civilized for the privilege of playing robber with Tom Sawyer. But at the end of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, he is done playing games. He's not grown up. He's not Injun Joe, the Duke, or the King, or any other disgusting adults that we see in these stories. Tom could grow up to be the Duke. He could grow up to be Judge Thatcher. But for Huck, there is only the Indian territory for him. That's the only place for him. So, yeah, only 20 minutes, I guess, to put up my final thoughts on that. But there, I didn't give you the play-by-play, but I think this is better. This is the way the novel has to be read. I think, for me, anyways. At least it's how I read it. It's a warning, like Tom Sawyer is essentially the liberal who play acts that change. And Tom Sawyer is the revolutionary who actually wants to get it done. And who's pulling the strings in this? It's Tom Sawyer's pulling the strings throughout the struggle. Huck Finn, with the real moral necessity and the willingness to sacrifice himself, is along for the ride for a lot of this end part of the novel. Right? And I think that's maybe where we're at in this world, unfortunately. So, that's it. So next episode, I'll look at Puddinghead Wilson. Just one episode on that novel. It's actually a little bit longer than 100 pages. It's more like 140 or 130. But just one episode on it. It's a morally very significant novel. It's written about a decade after The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I think we can talk about it fairly quickly, but it has certainly it's a very valuable book to read. Even as short it is, it does drag a little bit. I think it could have been told much more quickly, but we can tell Mark Twain was trying to do a couple things in that book. But we'll say more about that next time. So anyways, thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.
Then you took me to St. Louis, later on down the river. A freighter said she's been here, but she's gone, boy, she's gone. I found her trail in Memphis, but she just walked up the bluff. She raised a few eyebrows and then she went on down low. Now won't you bat it down by Baton Rouge, River Queen?